Hello and welcome, listener, to Contrast Media, hosted by me, Patryk and my co-host, Ben Francis.
Hello.
Each segment will begin with what we consider an impartial newsread of an ongoing event, followed by a looser discussion section where we will share our thoughts and opinions. Today, we will be talking about a recent report published by the National Union of Students and the ongoing UK-US bombing campaign of Yemen. For our first story, the National Union of Students, the NUS, has published a report outlining difficulties and failures in education. President of the Scottish NUS, Ellie Gomersall, led an online launch event on the 1st of February with representatives from the National Society of Apprenticeships, University and College Union, and the Educational Institute of Scotland, all present, all there to show solidarity and plan collaboration. The report is the first of 3 upcoming reports. This one focuses on gathering data and examples on where the Scottish education system has failed and what problems are facing students. The next report, to be worked on in the following weeks, will explore international solutions for these problems and their effectiveness. And the last report will aim to create an actionable plan of how to establish a stronger education system. The report from the 1st of February, which can be found online, lists some of the following stats. Over the last 10 years, university and college staff have faced a real terms pay cut of at least 20%. On the other hand, principals of top universities have had skyrocketing salaries, with some doubling or even tripling what the First Minister earns. 60% of students work alongside their studies, and of those working, 72% work over the QB Review's recommended 10 hours for working students. Average student rent rose by 34% between 2018 and 21, while average inflation over the same period was 1.8%. This disparity continues to grow as purpose-built student accommodation, PBSA, is not included in the Scottish Government's rent cap. 12% of students have experienced homelessness. Difficulties with housing have left more and more students commuting and relying on public transport, which varies in availability, consistency, and price across Scotland. The cost of public transport has been rising considerably above the rate of inflation. 74% of students in Scotland have reported low well-being, with 45% reporting experiencing a serious psychological issue they felt needed help. President of the Education Institute of Scotland, Anne-Marie Harley, brought up the issues of colleges struggling for credits and funding, leading to different institutions increasingly offering vastly different selections of courses, forcing more and more students to relocate or compromise on their studies. The EIS pledged support for the National Union of Students campaign and mentioned upcoming industrial action. The staff lead of the National Society of Apprentices, Ben Kinross, also offered up some of his society stats at the online launch. 50% of students are talking about cutting back on food. 20% are already cutting back on sanitary products. Scotland is the only part of the UK where apprenticeships have no legal training standards. Public money directed at apprenticeships is siphoned out, and there is fear amongst apprentices, stopping them from speaking up when paid under the minimum apprentice pay or when treated poorly. Ben, as students ourselves, surely we can relate to a lot of this. And I was wondering, just out of those stats there, I wonder if any of them stick out to you or maybe even relate to you on a pretty personal level.
Yeah, well, I think most students, me and you included, can relate to all of those statistics. The renting one in particular is obviously one of the most glaring ones because...
Especially in Glasgow
and in Edinburgh, especially in big cities. Rent's risen most in Edinburgh and Glasgow, I think, out of anywhere in Scotland. I remember I did research on that when I read a renting article, I think a year ago. I was looking at rent rises versus wage. So yeah, those stats are not surprising me out of the research I've done, but also because of my direct experience and basically being a student for about 6 years is one gap year and seeing the effect, seeing the rise in rents year on year versus my wage, especially for students, because students rely on, I guess, we would basically rely on our funding, which doesn't go up very much each year, which is outpaced by stuff like rent and it likely was inflation, grocery costs year by year, and from a job, but usually the jobs students can work will be minimum wage or gig economy jobs. Like I've worked, Deliveroo, Uber, etc., and the wage in the work I've done have stayed pretty similar. It went up by £1 or £2 in the last 6 years. Well, rent has went up by a ridiculous amount. So yeah.
So you mentioned like rent, like one of the main ones. Talk to me about like some of the compromises that like we've made, or maybe like some other students that we know have made. For example, like I study in Glasgow, but I live with family in Edinburgh because it just makes rent and living like so much cheaper. And I just bite the bullet on commuting and traveling 2 hours there and 2 hours back every day, 4 hours. And for other people, that's even worse. A lot of people get into like really big like flat sharing agreements. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, basically I've always had a flat share. It's pretty unaffordable for most students to be able to not flat share. You either flat share with a large amount of people, or as you're saying, you basically commute in. Like initially a couple of years ago, maybe like 5-6 years ago, or 5 years ago, when I first started studying or moved out and started studying, I could afford to live in central Edinburgh. But then as the years have basically went on, I've been pushed more and more to the periphery of the cities. I basically moved to Glasgow after my undergrad because rent in Edinburgh got up so much that I think the average rent in Edinburgh is like higher than the monthly SATs. Like I knew a lot of people whose monthly rent was more than the entire SATs they got. So basically they'd have to alongside your studying, work, and that was to pay for all their expenses, sometimes even a part of rent and the bills, plus doing a degree. So for me, I basically had to move out, move to Glasgow. That was cheaper rent, but now for the couple of years I've been in Glasgow, rent went up quite significantly. So now I moved to Greenock, which is a small town in the west coast of Scotland,
which means you're still having to commute anyway.
Yeah, exactly. But now even further. Like I'm being pushed out of Edinburgh to Glasgow, Glasgow to Greenock, and now I have to commute to get into Glasgow, basically, which I think a lot of people do.
Yeah. And so, I guess looking ahead, how do you feel about this like plan set out by the NUS, where like first they bring out this report, just looking at these stats, gathering up all this data on like what's a big issue, what's a bigger issue, maybe prioritizing them back and forth, and then looking at international solutions for this in the second report, until eventually in the third making solutions for Scotland. Personally, I guess I'll put this out. I think this is like a fantastic approach. I think that this is like really effective, like drawing advice from surrounding countries, trying to look at like comparable situations. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think that's a very like it seems like an approach is taking into account the perspectives of a lot of different bodies which represent students, and at the same time a lot of bodies which have a lot of sort of statistics and research capacity to actually find out the facts to help with that experience from students. It seems like a really good strategy. It seems quite a scientific model to get to a sort of policy platform that you can attempt to enact. But I'm just wondering, how effective do you having covered the first event, how effective do you think after the free events have been held and after they have their platform, how effective do you think that will be in actually changing government policy or university policy?
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, I mentioned that there were like a few different representatives of like different organizations there. And also it does seem like this is a very like far sweeping issue affecting a lot of people, and NUS seems to be like very directly in touch with students. I didn't really get into it in my report, but alongside these stats, there were also just sort of one-off like anecdotal stories, which kind of shows that like they were actually in touch with a lot of individual students, getting these going like really deep of exactly how all of these problems interlink and how they connect to each other. So I think with a level of care being put into it, you can expect like some pretty strong results. And then on top of that, like just how big and far sweeping the issue is and just how many people the NUS represents, I actually do have high hopes for this. Now obviously we're getting into big like speculation, opinion territory, but I do feel good, and it's one of the main reasons why I'm really excited to cover it and kind of like bring it into my journalism as much as possible.
Yeah, no, it's definitely interesting. It's definitely something to be hopeful for. Having a big movement like that with so many organizations does seem like, if anything, could influence real political change to try and address like renting issues being a massive one, and obviously all the other issues which you've spoken about. I mean, SaaS being one of them, the amount of funding you get, low paying jobs. I guess there are so many different issues, and of course student accommodation. Yeah. I wonder. I do wonder how effective it will be, because I think it would definitely depend on the government. When the free events, so like what the timescale is for this.
The second report, it was like they said they're going to be working on it over the next couple of weeks. So that could even mean that the second report could come in a month. But from what I've seen, they haven't given a specific date for it.
Okay.
I think they're really happy with like the work they've done so far, and then they're just now entering this like next stage of like where it takes them. And that's the impression I get.
So it seems more like short to medium term.
It seems like a short to medium term kind of thing, which is like very exciting.
Okay, yeah. So it's not some long term project which depends on like a couple of years down.
Now.
Yeah, that's what I'd imagine, because I didn't know anything about it until you tell me about it.
But the statement during, and maybe it was like a maybe it was a misspeak or like an offbeat like kind of thing, but like it was like, we will be working on a second report within the next couple of weeks.
Okay, no, that sounds definitely short to medium term. That's interesting. Okay, yeah, so it's very much like a developing story.
Yeah, it's something that like we can definitely continue covering whenever updates come up. We might even be able to bring somebody from the NUS on at some point to talk about it.
It would definitely be interesting to see the actual, like, after the thing is finished, the policy platforms presented, following it past that point as well, to see like how all these groups try and lobby politicians to enact, because I think like the SNP have a lot of control over housing law, and they're definitely not the Conservatives in terms of how willing they are to work with these kind of organizations.
Right, of course.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see how they try and engage with.
This is definitely something that's like part of like the SNP platform. Like this is like the kind of like thing that they like would espouse to sort of caring about and working towards. So I think it could be decently quite effective. Even Labour, if Labour ends up being in power whenever like the rest of this rolls out. I guess one final point, and it's okay because I don't have a very strong answer to this. Just from like your rough understanding of like education around the world, do you think there is anywhere like worth looking at? Is there anywhere where you even like subjectively, emotionally think that like the student experience is really well? I do not have a strong answer for this. I don't have like a very strong opinion.
I know this is, and the reports focus on Scotland or the whole UK, just
Scotland. This was like Scotland focused, yeah.
So free tuition fees basically. Something that's no, I don't know. I know other countries don't have as big of a problem with such high private renting,
right?
And I know there's
probably student accommodation in general.
Yeah. Well, I know there are places in the world, like I've heard like Vienna, for example, had a very sort of well-managed housing market. So rents are some of the cheapest out of any city in the world in Vienna, for example.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I don't know how they regulate student accommodation specifically, but if, it's one of the most well-rented housing markets in the world, I would assume that they would also, regulate, not basically give exemptions to these like student accommodation companies to basically act out with renting regulations, and have, I assume they would. So I think there are like, I would definitely point listeners to look into Vienna. That's, okay. I've done some research in that, and that's like very interesting. Yeah. There are definitely there's honestly a lot of cities around the world which have very independent housing policy in particular, I know, which I think would make a big difference for
I guess just quickly to wrap up, like some of these stories of student accommodation, especially for international students, is bizarre. This like I didn't understand. I didn't know this existed, but like usually when you sign up for student accommodation, it's sort of like on a contract, especially if you're an international student, where like you have to stay there for like 1 or 2 years or whatever, and you can't cancel that unless maybe with some massive like termination fee. And so what happens is like there's this culture of international students like subletting to future students. And so like the prices of these like student accommodations just keep going like higher and higher and higher as like further down the line different students pass on the accommodation to the next student, because maybe they decide that UK living is too expensive, they move back, or they like move place in general, or they move in with a partner or something like that. And it's like and they're all like tied to these what I interpret as pretty exploitative contract. But I guess international students were brought up quite a bit as well. That is still within the purview of like what the NUS is doing. It's not just like a national student kind of thing. So it'll be interesting to hear about like developments of that and how other countries manage it.
Yeah. No, I mean, definitely interesting is like one focal point to see what they do about student accommodation in particular, because that is like a very exploitative contract. International students and any student. Like there's no other renting agreement where you're set in for 8 months straight to pay rent legally. That doesn't exist. Any other, especially in Scotland, any other rental agreement, you can give 1 month notice and you leave.
Yeah.
But that's like, and the rent you pay. I actually stayed in student accommodation for 1 year, and it was quite a good experience because the social angle's quite good.
Right.
But at the same time, the actual flat quality is not any better than the rented flat. Therefore, I think it should be the same price as the rented flat, if not less, because students will have less money towards. Like,
sure. Yeah, I guess you'd imagine in a lot of ways, like with the way they're constructed, like it should be more efficient, like utilitarian kind of space.
Yeah.
Obviously, some come with a lot of utility, like whether it be like a gym or like a cinema room or stuff like that. But you'd imagine that like the way these are constructed in what I consider like pretty simplistic kind of like architectural terms,
they are,
you'd imagine they're a bit more efficient and you'd be getting a lot more bang for your buck.
Yeah.
But maybe zoning, planning, or whatever is bad,
maybe
there's this big exploitation on being directed towards students,
or maybe somebody's making a lot of money off the student accommodations.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people are making a lot of money off the student accommodations.
Never heard a good argument for why PBSAs, the purpose-built student accommodations, are excluded from rent caps.
I don't understand why they have completely different sort of like regulatory laws for accommodation.
It's a place where you live, like you like rent it. I
have no idea. I don't know why the rent in student accommodations are twice as high as the rent in flats.
Oh well, something to find out for next time.
It's a mystery, yeah.
So moving on to our next story. Would you like to introduce it?
Yeah, next story is talking about the UK's bombing campaign, the UK and US's bombing campaign of Yemen. So the British and American bombing of Yemen has entered its fourth week following strikes last Saturday that hit 32 Yemeni targets, with political leadership on both sides of the conflict refusing to back down. In recent weeks, the Houthi rebels who control most of Yemen have begun to target UK and US warships in the Red Sea in retaliation to the Anglo-American bombing of their country. Since the bombing began, the US has claimed to have destroyed over 60 Houthi targets, and according to the Houthis, they have lost 8 fighters. The UK and US's stated reasons for the bombings is to force the Houthis to stop their blockade of the Red Sea. That has caused a vast increase in the cost of global maritime trade, which has been going on since the Israeli invasion of Gaza last October. However, despite nearly all states wanting an end to the economic disruptions in global trade, only 2, the US and UK, supported logistically by Canada, Bahrain, Australia and the Netherlands, have decided bombing Yemen is the best way to achieve this. The Houthis have stated that they will continue the Red Sea attacks until Israel stops its war against Gaza, that has saw around 25,000 Palestinians as of now killed and millions displaced within the country. Houthi spokesmen have argued that they are trying to avert an atrocity or genocide, as they claim, while Western pundits have argued that the blockade is a cynical play to use anti-Western sentiment in the Arab world to gain support by taking a stand against Israel. So effectively, the Houthis trying to galvanize the anti-Israel mood in the Arab world to get support for them, because they are, after all, still involved in a civil war for control of Yemen with other factions which are more pro-Western. But regardless of Houthi intentions, the blockades linked to the war in Gaza, alongside the major practical issues with the idea of simply bombing the Houthis into submission, have resulted in the UK and US bombing campaign being quite internationally isolated. The fact that the vast majority of UN members voted for a ceasefire in Gaza a couple of months ago is an indicator for the first point. However, British and American leadership and their main political oppositions still advocate bombing, so I wanted to spend the rest of our time on Yemen talking about how realistic it is that the bombing campaign will end the Houthis' blockade, whether another course of action could be more effective in ending the blockade rather than just bombing, and lastly, what are the intentions of both the Houthis and the Anglo-Americans in this conflict. So to start off with effectiveness, Patrick, what do you think will be the impact or result of this British-American bombing campaign?
Sure. So going by statements that the Houthis have made, so far they're claiming that these missile strikes aren't having that big of effect on them. This isn't something that's gonna like dismantle them as a militant group. It's not something that's like gonna stop their operations. It might impede some things, but this isn't gonna like suddenly end everything. Obviously, the more Western allied surrounding neighbors, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, have kind of like said in the past that they are willing to potentially send troops into Yemen, given further escalation or further turmoil in the region, I suppose. So there is an avenue for future Western allied or UN Western coalition forces ending up there in another Afghanistan type situation. So yeah, I guess that's kind of where my thoughts are. There are avenues where this can get pretty rough. I don't see why the Houthis would start kicking up a storm and then sort of go randomly. So yeah, kind of pushing in that direction of sort of ground invasion or more direct conflict is kind of where my feelings are.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people in the West are definitely advocating for that. I just heard Ben Shapiro today, who is quite a prominent American right-wing pundit, effectively making the point that this current bombing isn't going to stop the Houthis because it's not heavy enough, basically. So, but he was making the argument, like what you were cautioning about, or just saying might happen, that no, we need to go in fully. And that's sort of, that's sort of what I sense might happen here. I feel like at the current moment, with the amount of bombing, the Houthis seem unlikely to be limited in their capacity to the extent that they can no longer cause major disruption. Because the thing is that with the Red Sea blockade, the Houthis only need to take out, enough ships as to make insurance costs for those ships going through the Red Sea so high to a point that ships reroute. Yeah, Patrick.
And sorry, just on that point, because I'm not sure if you clarified fully in your script. Could you talk about exactly what they are doing to these ships that are crossing through the sea? What's happening there?
Yeah, well, basically in the Red Sea, the Houthis, 2 weeks after October the 7th, and into Israel's invasion of Gaza, have effectively started turning ships back that they have claimed are connected with Israel, and now, out of Britain and America bombing them, connected with Britain and America, because the Houthis have escalated, and they're effectively turning ships back, and they are saying, as an attempt to put pressure on Israel to end the war in Gaza.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're talking about they would ride up to sail up to a ship, board it, be this is our ship now, you're gonna turn back, send that ship back, and then deboard that sort of thing.
Basically, yeah, sometimes helicopter in. There's some videos of Houthis landing in helicopters, running with guns, taking hostage. But these ship people don't have security, so there's no way to. And the Houthis are, they control the whole country. Yemen's got most of Yemen, 30 million people. They're very militarized. War for decades. Backed by Iran. They have quite a lot of capacity. So they have missiles. I mean, they don't have America's capacity, but they have missiles, helicopters. Quite full-on military infrastructure. So they have the capacity to send back enough of these ships. Even though they don't have that much capacity, they have enough capacity, and that is one of the issues with the logic of this bombing campaign, because it's unlikely you'll be able to damage their to the extent without a full-on regime change war like Afghanistan or Iraq to get to that point, especially when you look at the recent history. In 2015, Saudi Arabia started a campaign of bombing against Yemen to try and take the Houthis out, and half a decade on, the Houthis still have the capacity to strike within Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, which also was invading them. That's one of the reasons that war stopped, because the Houthis were very hard. They're a very hard force. They're quite a guerrilla-like entrenched force. So it's like similar to Taliban in that sense.
Yeah.
Not saying making any ideological comments.
So yeah, sort of the reason why I wanted you to expand a little bit on like exactly how these little seizures go, these little captures of like these ships, is from what you're saying, it doesn't sound like there's casualties or like even like long-term hostage taking, and I'm just wondering with like how a lot of like Western countries or like Western populations are getting more and more uneasy about conflicts and wars like year by year. How easy will it be to sort of like draw up support for a ground invasion from onto like a group that's basically just doing like economic damage onto you, but not really not killing anyone, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely will be a challenge, because definitely in America now, compared to in the 2000s, there's a lot more opposition to, like, an attempt of sending loads of American troops in, especially to the Middle East of all places, given the history of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. So many places in the Middle East America's committed so much resources to, and then they've effectively achieved nothing. Because you look at Iraq, it's not Iran backed. You look at Afghanistan, the Taliban are in charge. So I don't know how much. So I think there'd definitely be a lot of opposition in America for a full-on regime change war in Yemen. But there are senators and there are factions of the Republican Party who definitely support that. There's senators who came out and called for it. They went further. They called for bombing Iran regime. So there are also voices in America which want even more than a regime change war in Yemen.
Yeah, and I don't know if compared to the previous conflicts, I don't know if those previous conflicts have had as much support from neighbors for a ground invasion, and maybe like aid and assistance from them as well. Like it seems like it would be probably easier to like make effective and manage if like Egypt and Saudi Arabia and potentially other countries were to like sort of join that march.
Yeah, that's another pretty important point, because normally in the past when America has tried to do a ground invasion like that, they have the allies in place. Like when they invaded Iraq, I think they put troops in Saudi Arabia and invaded from there, for example. But it doesn't seem like this time they would be able to do that, because for two main reasons. The first one being that the fact that Yemen's blockade, or Yemen at least, have connected it so strongly with Palestine and Israel's war, it would seem unlikely that countries like Saudi Arabia or Egypt would be willing to let Western troops come in to then fight Yemen, because they would very much be seen by their own populations, who are very anti-Israel, as being on the side of Israel. They're basically letting American troops come into their country so they can invade Yemen, so Yemen stops the blockade, which Yemen claim to be anti-Israel.
Right.
So that would be pretty problematic.
I suppose I haven't considered that. That actually goes against the point I was making, because I was saying that we, like Western allies, would probably be able to get more assistance from Saudi Arabia and Egypt, since they are like pledging to potentially send troops. But you're saying that like there's also this uneasy tension of leaders of Saudi Arabia maybe not wanting to be seen as like Western puppets or something like that.
Well, because in Egypt and Saudi Arabia, both of these are dictatorships. And, the leadership need to watch out that their population, who are, like, the population of Egypt and Saudi Arabia, are very pro-Palestine. They don't like Israel. They don't even... There are also a lot of dislike towards even the United States in these countries, across the whole Arab world. So it would be definitely like a bit of a gamble for these countries to be in such a big way seen as directly lying with America, and given the context of Israel-Palestine, Israel as well, against, a force which is making itself out to be anti-Israel. That would seem dangerous. Saudi Arabia is also, just after a decade of being in a quagmire in Yemen, just dialing down that conflict and trying to normalize relations with Iran. There was a peace agreement brokered by China between Iran and Saudi Arabia a year or two ago. Yeah, so they it seems to me that Saudi Arabia wants to try and chill the situation out in the Middle East, and maybe want to move away from being at war. They maybe look around the world, look at America, Russia and Ukraine, America and Iraq, and they're like, this maybe isn't the most sustainable way to have a functional, strong country. Maybe they're trying to focus more on peaceful coexistence, I think.
Okay, I think that's a very, very strong case. I'll probably have to look into it a little bit more, but like right now, you've definitely kind of pushed me more in that direction. Like I kind of thought like a ground invasion could maybe be reasonable. I thought maybe you could have like backing in the area. I thought maybe it would have like better structure than something like Afghanistan in the past, but that does seem pretty complicated. So looking at the alternative approach, let's look at like appeasing the Houthis, and sort of de-escalating,
Yeah.
oh my god, de-escalating this conflict between Israel and Palestine. Let's talk about like the progress there. We mentioned before the show that Lord Cameron recently spoke about, made sort of like a general claim about making potentially moving towards like seeing Palestine as an independent state, establishing more of like that two-state system. This could potentially help with aid sending further down the line. Obviously you've got two ongoing court cases, one in the International Court of Human Rights, looking into whether what Israel is doing is currently a genocide. If that goes through and ends up falling on the side that yes, it is genocidal what they're doing, that will put a lot of pressure on them to stop. I also think that just in general, war fatigue is definitely setting in. I know we've been saying war fatigue has been setting in, but like it has continued setting in. It has continued progressing. I think in general people are more and more annoyed about these conflicts and tired of them, and kind of want their money and their efforts going somewhere else. So there's going to be like more and more of a timer on this. So yeah, talk to me about the potential of de-escalating there, having Israel actually like appease Palestine a bit more, and then in turn making the Houthis less aggressive.
Yeah, keeping in mind that is at least what the Houthis are saying. Yeah. They're arguing they're doing it because of the Israel's invasion of Gaza, and they will stop when the invasion ends. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that's the approach of probably the vast majority of countries in the world who want their global trade to get back to normal, in opposed to trying to invade the Yemen and try and bomb the Houthis into the mission. Yeah, I guess they're more hoping for the Israel-Palestine situation to resolve itself. Yeah, I agree with what you're saying about war fatigue. At a certain point, the Israelis will have to stop. I mean, there is a lot of international pressure, and I guess I keep hearing the US is pressuring them and saying for them to stop. I guess that will have some impact, but they have killed 25,000 people so far, so I don't know how much impact. And I wouldn't be surprised if I don't know if the Americans are putting too much pressure on, especially in light of the fact that America and Britain have now committed to this bombing campaign of Yemen as a sort of solution to that crisis, in oppose to trying to, for example, condition arms sales to Israel, or use their or use the leverage they have over Israel, which of course is like vastly more leverage than they have over Yemen, taking into consideration that the US and Britain are like main arms suppliers for Israel, so Israel relies on them for its very defense. Yemen the Houthis have just been declared a terrorist organization by America, which they always do to people they don't like, I guess. So I don't know how much leverage America had over the Houthis in Yemen. I don't think it had any apart from bombs. But Israel, the Americans have a lot of leverage over Israel,
right?
So yeah,
or potentially leverage over Palestine if they were to cooperate with it.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah. The Palestinian Authority, for example, in West Bank, yeah, which is more Western friendly, or more neutral even. I wouldn't say Western friendly. Yeah, America has a lot of influence over that. Yeah, so definitely, like that, I would agree. That would seem to me as a more rational and ethical, my opinion, way for the Americans and British to try and stop the Yemeni blockade by also trying to. But by doing that, by pressuring Israel, their big ally, sure, to stop, their campaign. And the bonus would be that would also stop tens of thousands of people dying in Gaza. And might be more achievable.
Absolutely. I will also kind of like reiterate that it's still not an easy solution. Palestine does have a population and leadership that is very hostile towards Israel, and with any sort of short-term appeasement, you're risking just letting them launch another attack onto Israel, and having this continuation of this really, really long conflict between Israel and Palestine, which has been waging for so long. So yeah, I'm just putting that out there for viewers that might be like lacking context, because there are strong reasons for what is there are possible explanations for Israel's bombardment and Israel's hostility, I suppose, yeah, it just kind of complicates this issue, and it makes every solution kind of like not great.
Yeah, I would agree every solution would be challenging.
Yeah.
Although, yeah, I do think a solution which involve the US at least trying to use influence to stop a war which, wherever you stand in the war, has killed tens of thousands of Palestinians.
Absolutely.
And destroyed nearly every city in Gaza, and probably ruined the lives of like hundreds of thousands of people when you look at just like the mass migration of everybody in Gaza.
Lots of people displaced.
Yeah.
I think
I mean,
over at least over 50, at least over 40%, but I think at least over 50% of buildings have been to some extent damaged. You know, we've got a lot of like infrastructure problems. This is very like, you know, permanent, almost now irreparable seeming kind of damage to the country. That will take a lot of effort to rebuild and put on track and put into a position where it doesn't think that violence is the only answer.
Yeah. I mean, like right now, what's happening, what Israel's doing to Gaza is definitely not a long-term solution. You can't
unless they destroy all of it.
Unless they literally kill everybody there, or kick them all out and commit
which,
genocide.
to be clear, doesn't seem like being exactly their goal. You know, as high as the death stats are, Israel has killed maybe 1% of the Palestinian population, while obviously having the means to potentially do a lot more. Maybe the only reason they don't do more is because it would face so much international backlash. But in general, you know, they seem to be going with this like anti-Hamas agenda as opposed to like this anti-Palestine agenda. But they are massively damaging all of Palestine in the process.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can get into the discussion whether or not what they're doing. Is it genocide? Is it an ethnic cleansing? Is it just self-defense? Although killing 1% of the entire population of a region in self-defense seems insane to me.
Absolutely. It's a massive number. I'm just making the point that they do have a capability of doing more, and you could say that the fact that they don't do more just kind of shows that they aren't just trying to wipe out Palestinians. There's like this actual attempt at Hamas prioritization at play. Although I would question this great intel that is guiding them of like where Hamas hypothetically is, and the fact that like over 50% of Palestinian buildings could have been involved in it. I mean, they could have been, but it's just like I don't place that much faith into Israeli intelligence at this point.
I mean, maybe we can have a later podcast, perhaps in linking with South Africa's.
It'll be interesting when these court rulings kind of go through and when this like conversation develops. Definitely something we should look into.
And in our discussion period, we could maybe, you know, try and really get into like what it is. You know, is it a genocide? Is it ethnic cleansing? We can look at like the statements of Israeli politicians. We can look at intent. You know, we can look at the actions going on. We can proportionality. We can look at like international law. What's a war crime? What's a crime against humanity? Do these apply to Israel? I think we might have some disagreement there, but it'd be very interesting to talk to and at least cover, you know, the recent developments, especially in relation with South Africa.
And to be clear, especially here, I haven't like directly maybe disagreed with anything you stated. I'm just trying to make sure that like the other side is represented, because there are elements of this of the argument that I just provided that I actually do think are important considerations and are part of like the wider dialogue. I just definitely don't think that they give Israel carte blanche to what they are currently doing. And I think that wraps us up. Yeah,
that's us done.
Well, thank you so much for listening, listener. Hopefully you've enjoyed. Maybe you've learned something. And this has been Patryk Witkowski, joined by
Ben Francis.
And thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.
See you later.